Awesome. So we'll get started then. My name is Meredith. I work for the Harvard Grace Maritime Museum and Environmental Center, and I am the Environmental Center Manager for the museum. And today I'm going to be giving a lecture about submerged aquatic vegetation. I'll be referring to it as SAVs likely for most of the lecture, but they've got a million different names. There's submerged aquatic vegetation, there's, they shorten it to SAVs, there's bay grasses, there's sea grasses. They got a whole host of names, but I'm gonna call them SAVs. So the main takeaways from this lecture, what are SAVs and why are they unique to other types of plants? They're not quite like terrestrial plants, they're not quite like algae, they're sort of in their own category of plants altogether. So I'm going to be talking about how they can be differentiated from other plants. I'm also going to discuss why they're important, so why they're something to pay attention to, why they're something to learn about, and why they matter to both us and the greater ecosystem. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about how the museum is monitoring SAVs, what we're doing to help, and how you all can get involved if that's something you find interesting. Okay, so what are SAVs? By definition, they're a group of flowering vascular plants. And I'm going to break down the flowering and the vascular definition in just a minute here. But as I mentioned before, they go by a lot of different names. You might have heard them as bay grasses, sea grasses, SAVs, any of the above. There are 500 different types of SAVs worldwide. So a really high diversity in the species. Around here, there are 20 plus types you can find in the bay, but only 17 commonly found. And when I say commonly found, I've only found 7 or 8 species this whole summer. So it sort of depends on what part of the bay you're in, because they can survive in freshwater, saltwater, and brackish water, which is a combination of fresh and salt. Where we are here is a tidal fresh, so the water has very little salt in it. So there are 11 or 12 species that are freshwater SAVs, and then the farther south you go, you get some more of the saltwater species. So depending on where you are in the bay, you're going to see different types because they can survive in all sorts of different water types. And around here, we're in a really important spot for SAVs. We have the Susquehanna Flats, which are right up there, have the highest diversity and abundance of SAVs in the whole bay. So the research that we're doing here at the museum, which is something that you all can get involved in the future if you have interest, is particularly important because there's so much to see, and there are a lot of efforts going on through the state, through other organizations to try to protect them and to expand the range. So understanding what they look like here and what different types we have helps get a better picture of what the future of the bay could look like in other places where there aren't as many. And just for a little bit of background on the Chesapeake Bay, it's the largest estuary in the country and the 3rd largest estuary in the world. An estuary is a water body that's fed by saltwater and freshwater sources. And so estuaries are, with the changing salinity in freshwater, depending on how much ocean water is coming in or how much it's raining or if there's a drought, that variation in saltwater and freshwater makes it hard for certain species to survive. So you wind up getting a really cool diversity of species that are able to survive those types of conditions. So estuaries are really important habitats for more reasons than I have time to get into, but this one is the largest that we have in the country. So it's important to understand and pay attention to. Also, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just jump in. So I said before that by definition, they're vascular flowering plants and they live underwater. When I say vascular, it's probably exactly what you're thinking. They have veins. similar to other types of plants, other types of terrestrial plants. And those veins work mostly to bring nutrients from the sediment up to the tips and to bring energy that they create from photosynthesis all the way through the plant. So it's sort of like a tube bringing nutrients back and forth. That's what the vascular system is. Not all plants have a vascular system. Algae do not, for example, but SAVs do. And the flowering part is something that I find really interesting. Seeing flowers underwater is just kind of like, it blew my mind a little bit the first time I saw it. Like, I know that plants evolved from terrestrial plants, but terrestrial plants evolved from underwater plants, so underwater plants had to have flowers at some point. I don't know, I've just never seen an underwater flower before I started doing this research, and it's just the coolest thing to me. Anyways, so the flowers are grown on the plant for the reason that you think. Similar to terrestrial plants, it's so that way they can spread pollen, have that pollen go to other plants, and then they can go to seed and reproduce that way. The pollen is spread and dispersed by tides and water activity. I'm also going to talk about an article in a little bit about these bees of the sea, which are invertebrates that actually bring pollen from some SAVs to another, which is the coolest thing ever. But yeah, so they make flowers for the purposes of reproduction. The flowers that I've seen, the ones that you all might have seen also, are the yellow ones. Does anybody have a boat or go on the water often in kayaks or swimming or anything like that? Okay, has anybody seen those little yellow flowers? Okay, they were blooming 2 weeks ago. I haven't seen any in the past week. But not even, like right on the shore here and up until you hit that, the channel, because then you can't really see them anymore. But yeah, awesome. Look out for them next time you're on the water, because they're all flowering at different times, but there's little white flowers on wild celery, and I just think it's really neat. So, we're going to talk about reproduction next, speaking of flowering. They undergo reproduction in 5 different ways, interestingly. So SAVs can reproduce sexually or asexually. Some plants can do both in one species. So the way that they are able to reproduce sexually, we already talked about this for a little bit. They spread pollen, that pollen goes to other flowers, they go to seed, and then they can reproduce from there. The seeds are also dispersed by the water current and then eventually take root and then grow from there. But they can also, some species are able to release these sort of shoots from the plant that are like a mini plant that they're growing, like a baby, I guess. And then they break off, float somewhere else, and then take root that way. So they can do those little shoots. That is under the sexual reproduction umbrella, or they can spread pollen and make seeds that way. As far as asexual reproduction goes, the first way that they are able to reproduce, if you want to call it that, is spreading rhizomes underneath the substrate, sort of like the way that mushrooms operate. They spread, not really quite like roots, but sort of, out, and then SAVs grow from those, and then they go farther and farther. So it's actually believed that the largest living organism is an SAV bed, because it's just one plant that keeps growing and spreading under the substrate and then popping up. They also reproduce by fragmenting. So the SAV, when it's disturbed, can break, and those pieces can then float somewhere else and take root, sort of like propagation. And they can also do something called I forgot the last one, but yeah, they reproduce in all sorts of different ways. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. We're getting into a lot more detail than I'm sure you all thought you were signing up for here, but I just think that this stuff is really neat. And thinking that they're able to reproduce so many different ways, and sometimes in one plant, is interesting.
I do have one question that maybe you'll cover.
Yeah.
And that's the kelp beds, especially on the west coast.
Yeah.
Are they this type of vegetation?
I don't think they're SAVs, no, because I don't think that they're vascular.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
They don't look like they're veins.
Yeah.
Another topic.
But also, they're important as well. So, the bees of the sea. I found this article online by a publishing company called New Scientist. The article was by Emily Benson. And it was, so somebody noticed that it seemed like there were these tiny little organisms that were moving from flower to flower and might be aiding in pollination, which is a crazy concept. But somebody thought that that's something that they noticed. So at the University of Mexico's Marine Science Institute, they did a study to see if this had any merit. And in order to do so, they kept a group of SAVs in one tank and another group in another tank. And in one, they had these invertebrates in there, and in the other, they didn't. And they watched for quite a while, but they noticed that in as quick as 15 minutes, they saw pollen spreading to other SAVs in the one that had invertebrates, whereas in the one that didn't, they didn't see any movement of pollen. So pollen can be dispersed by water, but they noticed that there's actually something to these bees of the sea, they call it, that are bringing pollen from one flower to another. And they're doing that not just because they're good Samaritans and they care about SAVs, but because they like the pollen, they like to eat it, but some of it gets stuck to them when they move from flower to flower. So these are some images of the different bees, and the circled parts are little bits of pollen that are getting stuck to them and moving around. So what makes them different from other things? They're, as I mentioned in the beginning, not quite like terrestrial plants and not quite like algae. Nowadays, if you look at the bay, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between SAVs and algae because the algae completely cover them. But they are, in fact, different plants. If you pick up an SAV, you can sort of get the slime off of them and get the algae off of them, and there are plants underneath. But at this point, they're pretty much covered, which isn't super healthy for them, and we'll talk about that later. But as far as what...
I was thinking that's the problem.
The algae?
That question I asked you yesterday. Yeah, and it coats them.
Yes.
I thought somehow they produce them on top, different, separate.
Right.
It's on the plant.
Yeah, it's on the plant, stuck to the plant. So it makes it hard for them to photosynthesize, among other things.
Yes.
But they are different from algae, and they are different from terrestrial plants, which are plants that you can find on land. They have really loose stems, like they're sort of floppy. If you take them out of the water, they just collapse. They don't have that rigidity that terrestrial plants do because they want to float to the surface in order to get sunlight. So they're most likely to get sunlight in order to photosynthesize near the top, so they're pretty loosey-goosey in order to float that way. They also have little pockets of air in some of them that act as sort of like a flotation device. So that way they can be buoyant and be close to the top. They also don't have, terrestrial plants have something in them called a stomata, which is a part of the cell structure which allows them to take in water and release water depending on what they need to do. So if they've got too much water in them, they're able to let it go. If they don't have enough, they're able to close that valve sort of thing. So that way they're not perspiring or releasing, transpiring and releasing water. SAVs don't have that. They're full of water and constantly, that way, and they get their water from the root system. But they don't have that sort of like open and closing structure that allows them to regulate water because they're completely submerged all the time. And they're different from algae because they root, they're vascular, and algae is more of a free-floating kind of situation. Algae also don't have a root system to absorb nutrients. As I said before, they're free floating. And they have specialized cells that they use to take in nutrients. So SAVs are different than a lot of other types of plants. So why do we care? Why are people listening to the differences between SAVs and other things and the reproduction and all that stuff, you know? Why are they important and why are they something to pay attention to? SAVs provide a lot of ecosystem services, provide a lot for people. SAVs provide food, nursery habitats, and regular habitats for all sorts of species that we typically find important, like blue crabs and fish, and a lot of things that we care about because they're part of the ecosystem and because they're part of the commercial fishing industry. So there are a lot of different kinds of fish and crabs lay their eggs in SAVs because it acts as, they can feed off of the algae when they emerge from their eggs, and also it gives them a little bit of protection. And they're also a habitat for lots of grown-up different species. If you go through the SAV beds, every time I see lots of fish and sometimes turtles and tons of little snails growing on them. So they're like their own little ecosystem for all sorts of different living things. They also improve the water quality, so they're able to take in a lot of excess nutrients that go into the waterway. So things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which typically go into the bay because of pollution runoff. So when it rains over an area of land, it takes with it all the crap on the ground into the waterway. So runoff from farm fields, you know, farmers use a lot of nutrients in order to grow their crops, but sometimes that gets washed away into a waterway. Also pollution from other activities, not just farming. But nitrogen and phosphorus in the bay are nutrients for bay creatures just like they are for farm crops. So there are certain species that just grow in excess abundance when they have access to lots of different kinds of nutrients, like algae and cyanobacteria and lyngbia and all sorts of other things you might hear on the news that are making dogs and kids sick. So SAVs take in a lot of those nutrients and then don't make anybody sick. So they're good. And algae also, if they're taking all of those nutrients from the algae so that way they can't grow in excess and make people and animals sick, they're also helping preserve oxygen because that algae that you see on the top of the water just sucks the water column dry of oxygen, which leads to fish kills and all sorts of other things. So SAVs not only take in those nutrients and help prevent algal blooms, they also produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. They can take in different kinds of pollution and store them in the sediment or in their biomass. And they can take carbon out of the water so that way it isn't released as carbon dioxide. They do a lot of good. Even slowing wave activity, which helps prevent erosion from the land, all sorts of stuff. They're really, really important to the bay, which is why people are really trying now to pay attention to them and try to preserve them. So at the museum, we're part of a research project under the umbrella of the SAV Watchers program. I go out, at this point, weekly. It all depends on my schedule and the other things that have going on. But I try to go out at least once a week to look for changes in abundance, changes in species, and just be able to report back, I saw this type of SAV here at this time, so that way the biologists who are heading this program can have an understanding about what's happening around here. So this data is collected usually on a kayak, which is a lot of fun. Sometimes we take motorboats out so that way we can get to some of the farther parts, but usually I'm just out on a kayak collecting data. I have a group of volunteers who comes with me to do this, and if at the end of this lecture you're really jazzed about bay grasses, then you're more than welcome to join this research effort. We go out weekly, and we'll be doing the same thing next summer and the following. So if you like to kayak and you're into this stuff, we could definitely use the help. So the data that we're collecting is some with different instruments. We collect the GPS points of where we are, the tidal activity, the water clarity, which we use a SEPI disk for. And then we are, from there, just looking at what types of species do we have here, what percentage of the ground are they covering, are they at the surface, are they flowering, do we see seeds, and how much of each type of species are we finding. And we try to go out to several different parts of the bay from our launch point, which is next to the lighthouse out there, and just collect as much data as we can. Because this, as I mentioned before, we're part of a greater organization, and they're all volunteer run. So all of the data that they get is from volunteers, because it's a massive bay, and they are, like a lot of other science-based organizations, they don't have a lot of staff, and they're not funded as well as they probably should be, and so most of the data they collect is from people who are just interested, and I'm one of them.
Meredith, what is the season for doing this? It's not all year round.
Yeah, good question. So SAVs are only out in certain months of the summer. They pop up around June or July, and will probably all be gone by when it starts to get a little bit colder. So end of September, early October, around then. So it's a pretty short window.
They just die back and they see them back, and what happens?
Yeah, so they,
Like a terrestrial plant.
yeah, they pop back up again in the following year, but they don't stick around in the winter. They can really only survive when it's warmer. Yeah.
So are there other, I think you mentioned there are other groups, volunteer groups throughout the bay
Yeah.
doing this. Can you briefly compare and contrast the SAVs, let's say, in Susquehanna Flats versus other parts of the bay? I know
Yeah.
there's various reasons.
So the Susquehanna Flats are believed to be, it's believed that they have the highest diversity and abundance of bay grasses in the entire bay. So we're in a really important spot for them, for monitoring, for collecting this data. And the purpose of collecting this data is so that way researchers can look and see, okay, here's where bay grasses are, here's where they used to be and aren't anymore, and here's where they haven't been in a really long time. And they can start to focus on spreading seeds, repopulating certain areas, and determining if certain areas look a lot worse than others, maybe there's something bigger going on that needs to be paid attention to. But this data goes towards restoration. I myself am not collecting seeds and dispersing them. You have to get a whole different set of training, and it's a whole different thing. But yeah, I'm collecting this data, and to answer your question, Susquehanna Flats have the best, in my opinion, and the opinion of Brooke, who's the chairperson of this program, the best diversity and abundance. Yeah.
Is that because it's fresh water compared to further south it's salt water and they do better in fresh water?
It's partially because it's freshwater, and there are more species that can survive in freshwater than salt or brackish. There's a whole range of salinities that they're able to handle each individual plant type, but there's a higher range of plants that are able to survive in the freshwater. Because we have the freshest water, since we're basically right where the Susquehanna River ends. If you go for a walk on the promenade, you can actually see a little podium that says this is where the Susquehanna River ends. It's basically all fresh up here. So that is a big contributing factor. It's also because it's so shallow here. So SAVs like warmer water, they like shallower water because they're able to get access to the sun easier. So it's a combination of those things. But as I mentioned, this research is really fun. You get to go out on a kayak and look at grasses and see what you can find. So join us. I think it's so much fun.
Do you see fish out there?
Yeah, I see lots of stuff. I saw a really big fish last week, and it went right under my kayak and bumped me a little bit. It was cool. So if you have interest, we've got availability. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the most common species that you might find out here. If you're a boater, if you swim, if you kayak, whatever around here, the most common ones you're going to see are these two. The one on the left is hydrilla. It sort of looks like a tail almost in the water, with all of these little leaves that come off from the center of the stem. They look like a little circle of leaves that all come off from the same spot, and then you go up the stem and there's another section and another. And they have little tooths on their leaves, sort of. It looks like a serrated leaf. But if you're looking at the water, you're going to find those most likely around here. A lot of people, I see them pulling it off their motors and underneath their boats and all that. So hydrilla is invasive, unfortunately, but the state of bay grasses is not great. So despite the fact that they're invasive, a lot of people in the field are just happy that there are grasses in the water to begin with. So even though they're invasive, even though we'd rather have the native ones for a lot of the reasons that I'm sure you're all familiar with, they're a grass and they're here. So at the very least, we're getting the ecosystem services from them of carbon sequestration, creating oxygen, being habitat, all that stuff. So that sort of goes to show how you never really hear anybody saying, go invasives. But the fact that there just aren't a lot of grasses out here, it's better to have some than none, basically. So you'll see a lot of that one. You'll also see a lot of wild celery. That's the long stringy one. And yeah, those are usually the two most common, but some other types that I've seen are, starting from the left, we have hornwort. It looks sort of similar in this picture to the hydrilla, but the leaves are a lot crunchier and they're really stiff. It's sort of like pine needles, tiny little pine needles. And they come off in little clusters going up the plant. So I see a lot of coontail or hornwort. They're interchangeable names. I also see a lot of water stargrass, which has that really cool flower that I was telling you about earlier. These two are different kinds of naiads up in the top right. There's a lot of different kinds of naiads that you can find, but it's really, really difficult to discern them. So difficult, actually, that on the data sheet you can just put general naiad because you have to really, really know what you're doing to be able to tell the difference. So two different types of naiads. These are most similar to the pictures of, or ones that I've seen out in the bay. They sort of look like fluffy little bushes down there. Over here is curly pondweed on the end. I've only seen that in a few spots, but that one's really easy to distinguish from other types. In the middle, we have Eurasian milfoil. I've seen a lot of this one. Sometimes it can get confused with the, up in the corner, the hornwort or coontail, but the leaves are a lot less concentrated on the milfoil. And then this is not an SAV, it's algae, but it's probably 97% of what you're seeing out there at this point. So I figured I'd put it up there just so that way you know. But this is what is pretty much covering all of the SAV that I've found by now. Yeah. So they're still surviving, the bay grasses, it just makes it difficult.
The algae, why are they able to have oxygen dead zones? Aren't they also doing photosynthesis and making oxygen instead of using it?
Yeah, certain types. It really depends on what type of algae it is. A lot of the algae that you see out in the bay isn't necessarily a problem other than that it suffocates the bay grasses. But there are certain types of algae that really thrive in beds that do deplete the water column. But it's very like species specific.
Cyano something or other that you talked about.
Cyanobacteria, yeah. Another one is called Lingbia. That one I haven't seen yet, but
So
it's sort of.
cyanobacteria is an animal, not a plant.
Oh yeah.
Again.
It's a combination of them actually. It's sort of like lichen. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Oh, it's like a combination of things working together.
So that's
Yeah.
what.
Are they all natural? As opposed to invasive? All these-
Yeah, all of these are native.
Maybe.
Yep.
And when you take a volunteer out, it is interesting, it sounds kind of fun.
Yeah.
And, you know, this volunteer would know nothing to begin with. Do they take a picture and compare it, find it in the book, or, you know?
Yeah, we bring out ID guides, and even
Okay.
though I'm the person who's certified, I'm flipping through my book all the time.
Okay.
Because it's not an easy business identifying the difference between tiny little plants that all look the same. But yeah, I take volunteers out, and I'm certified to train volunteers on how to do this. So if you know nothing about them, which you all already know more than most people, because of this, then yeah, we'll get you up to speed. But it's really about, I mean, I took classes on this in order to get certified, but the only thing that actually helped was going out in the field and looking at them, because they look so different than the pictures a lot of the time. But yeah, we seek out whoever wants to be a part of it. So, this is the data that we are contributing to, but this is the data that is coming from the SAB Waters program. So, these are the total acreage of SAVs over time. So, since the project started in the 80s, actually I think that the project started in the late 70s, but at least for this graph, the end is 1984. We have seen an increase in bay grasses. I think that this might have a laser, I don't know where, but do you know? Okay, I don't know why I think it does, but either way, I can use my finger. So, this is the beginning of this data plot. I do think that the program started earlier than 1984, but that's the beginning of this. And you can see that things increased for a while, a little dip, increased for a while, a little dip, and then things have gotten a lot more sporadic from there. It seems like there's a new trend of grass is doing well, grass is doing well, grass is doing well, and then a year when there's either a lot of flooding or drought, and then they get wiped out. So 2019 was one of those years where things dropped dramatically, as you can tell. And for reference, the SAB Waters program, as a part of the EPA, is trying to get the acreage totals in the whole bay to be 185,000. Right now, we're between 70 and 80,000. So, not even close to the goal. And the goal isn't even like by 2030, we want 185,000 acres. It's just open-ended because it's kind of lofty, but we're hoping to get there, and volunteer help is part of the way that we get there. Any questions on this?
I remember releases out of the too much water coming through the Conowingo Dam, and that sediment being so strong
Mm-hmm.
that killed off the bay grasses on the flats pretty much. I don't remember what year that was. But
Yeah.
that's because the sunlight doesn't get through, but also it covered up the sort of another layer of soil on top of things.
Yeah, so when we get a lot of water and that goes through the Conowingo Dam has been completely full of sediment and that little reservoir behind it since 2015. So ever since then, every time it rains a lot of that sediment gets washed into the water below. Sediment is just free-floating soil. It's soil where it's not supposed to be, basically. And other things like pollutants and other crap. But the sediment, when it's suspended in the water, causes all sorts of issues for lots of different kinds of animals and also plants. So it makes it hard for fish to breathe. It makes it hard for them to hunt and see what they're trying to eat. And it also severely impacts the clarity of the water. So SAVs can't get sunlight the way that they need to in order to photosynthesize, and it also can push them down a little bit if there's too much of it and it's too heavy. So when you get a lot of water, you can see how that would impact, especially around here with the Conowingo Dam. But there are other reasons why lots of rain impacts SAVs. It changes the salinity. So in certain parts of the bay, if there's a lot of rain and it's supposed to be saltier, and that's what the bay grasses around there are, then lots of fresh water will lessen the salinity, and then you're going to see differences. So, yeah.
Chart goes to 2020. Based on your weekly observation things, does this look like a particularly good year or a bad year for the SAVs?
So I've only lived here for a year. So I don't know if I can myself see a difference in things. I know that Brooke said that it's looking okay, and she's the one who is in charge of this project. I put her contact info at the end of this presentation if anybody wants to know more. She's the chairperson for the SAV work group, and she's also a biologist with the DNR. But yeah, I don't know how things are doing this year compared to others, but I think she said that it's looking better since that 2019 drop.
I mean, we kayak on the Tapsco, the tributaries of the Tapsco. It
Yeah.
seems to be very, very more populated with SAVs than the past few years.
Oh, good.
I think we do there.
That's something then, yeah. So we talked a little bit about already, I've sort of thrown it in there in different areas where it was applicable, what SAVs need to survive. So that can then lead us into stressors, what's causing them to have such low acreage totals when we know what we want and we know what we're getting is a lot below that. So SAVs need, like all plants, light in order to photosynthesize. Photosynthesis is the process of taking carbon dioxide and light and creating energy with oxygen as a byproduct. And the energy is a type of sugar. So they need a lot of sunlight, just like all plants, in order to conduct photosynthesis. They also tend to like warmer, shallower waters. Because of, if they're shallower, they're able to get to the sun easier. But also they tend to be warmer in shallower areas anyway. It's a lot warmer right on the shore than it is in the middle of the channel. So they like warmer water. They can typically be found at depths of less than 3 meters because of those light requirements and warmth requirements. But there are some species that can be found as low as 58 meters, interestingly. But it's probably got to be really clean water around there. Again, different types of SAVs can survive in different amounts of salinity. So even though I say that SAVs can survive in fresh, salt, and brackish, there are different species that can survive in each range. So changing in salinity or salt too quickly because of drought or flooding or salting the roads and all that goes into the waterway, that can impact what types of SAVs can survive. And if, we had a ton of salt getting put into the bay right now, all those species would be wiped out. So they're particularly sensitive to salinity. There are just different types that can survive in different ranges. Does that make sense? Okay. Temperature is also a requirement. They like warmer water. If things are too cold, then they actually can't reproduce. So it's a major issue if it's a particularly cold year for them to be able to go to seed, spread seeds, go through asexual reproduction. So even if it's colder and it looks like they're doing okay, the following year you'll see a difference. And lastly, they are impacted by wave action and also the type of substrate that's at the bottom. So just like certain plants like low acidity or high acidity or whatever, SAVs also have their preferences. But for wave action, they, if it's too intense, then they can get washed away and ripped up from the root.
What is the bottom like in the flats? Is it sandy or mucky or?
Pretty variable. Around here, it's mostly sand and mud. A little bit farther towards the flats, it's pretty sandy. I'm sure there's peat around here somewhere. I haven't found it, but it's mostly sand and mud, or rocky. But there's usually sand underneath that. So, but actually, it varies a lot more than I thought it would. So, yeah.
What about the cloudiness of the water? Does the salinity affect the cloudiness?
I don't know if salinity affects the cloudiness. It might. I think the cloudiness is usually caused by suspended sediments rather than salt. But maybe the salt impacts what types of little living things can grow, and I personally don't know if there's a relation. I don't think so, but there might be somewhere. Okay. So knowing what they need to be healthy, we can then figure out what stresses them out. So what threatens SAVs? A whole bunch of stuff. We've talked about a lot of them already, so I won't dwell too long on this. But the primary culprit is nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. Yes, they can take it into their biomass and utilize it, so that way it isn't in the water column anymore, but too much nitrogen and phosphorus leads to lots and lots of algae, which float at the top. And the types of algae that we don't want are the ones that float right at the top and then block them from being able to get sunlight below. So too much nitrogen and phosphorus is an issue. They're sensitive to storms and floods, as I talked about before, because it changes temperature, it changes salinity, it changes what they're used to, and it does it really quickly, so they don't really have time to adapt. The impact that pollution runoff has on SAVs became particularly evident in the mid-20th century because agriculture intensified and lots of different fertilizers are used on crops in order to have them grow. But they do get washed off sometimes and into the waterway. And that's one of the biggest stressors to bay grasses. Another massive stressor that impacted things, it's actually not even on that graph, because it was in the 70s. The tropical storm Agnes wiped them out. And that's before the time range of the graph, but that would be really interesting to see what the actual acreage total was. I do know that it was the largest flood on record and destroyed a massive amount of SAV population in the whole bay. So recovering from that has taken a long time. And there are certain things that contribute to regional SAV loss. There's something called a slime mold that causes a wasting disease on them, and it just causes them to die off. But that's mostly eelgrass, which is a saltwater SAV. So lots of stressors. We also talked about dams. Dams cause sediment to go through. Too much sediment makes it hard for them to get sunlight, all that jazz. So that's mostly what's threatening them. So in order to protect SAVs, the work has to come from a lot of different places. We have to be preventing runoff, which the living shoreline in Havre de Grace. How many of you know about the living shoreline in Havre de Grace? Okay, so for those of you who don't, the city is putting a lot of plants on the edge of the shore, so that way, when it rains heavily, that water is slowed, and it's slowed by the plants that are planted on the shore, and hopefully even filtered by certain plants. So that way, you're not seeing as much flooding with pollutants going into the bay. So that's something that's really helpful, and that's something that the city is doing to try to protect the water. But we have to maintain water clarity, we have to try to prevent runoff and pollution, in addition to monitoring SAVs and spreading seeds and doing the restoration efforts and all of those things. So there's a lot that goes into it, but there are a lot of people that are working on it. So the SAV Watchers Work Group is, as I said before, entirely volunteer-based, and the fact that it's able to run and be so successful at all is astounding, that people are willing to just, do that for no pay. And it's a lot of fun, but it just shows that it feels to me like enough people care that the future is bright. So that's all I got. Yeah.
What about the other stressors of like wildlife and certain fishes, overeating certain vegetation at certain times of the year? I'm thinking of back in the during the right after the Agnes era, generally in the decade of the 1970s, there was a large amount of bluefish in the bay throughout the entire bay. You don't see that much, and then of course the rockfish seem to come and so forth. What kind of stress does the fish habitat have on this vegetation? And other wildlife too.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
So fish, I'm not sure if they're having a really bad impact on SAVs around here. I know what is impacting SAVs are ducks and geese, who really like to munch on wild celery. The canvasback duck, the Latin name for it is the same, part of the Latin name is the same as the Latin name for wild celery, because they like to eat it so much that it was named after it. But yeah, I mean, if you look out there, they're munching away. So I know that they have an impact, and they also have an impact on the living shoreline. Geese ate all of the plants that we planted out there when we first did that project. So what are you gonna do? But I think that the bigger threats posed are man-made, but I'm not sure about fish. So that's a good question, but I don't have an answer for you about fish. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there any difference between seagrass and seaweed?
Yes. So, I know that there are certain types of seed grasses who are under the SAV umbrella. Seaweed is something else entirely, but seed grasses are sort of like the overarching term for any type of grass or plant that can live in saltwater areas. There are some types of seagrasses that are SAVs. There are a lot that aren't, but seagrasses is more like the overarching term for saltwater plants. Mm-hmm.
With the algae being free floating, is there any effort into trying to skim it or somehow remove it?
Yeah, that would help a lot. It's an easier project said than done. And I know that it's possible, and it's been done in certain places. What you have to look out for is
fertilizer or something. Is there some other use for it?
For fertilizer?
The algae.
Oh, the algae. I'm sure.
That would make that more
Worth it.
more
Yeah.
doable.
I'm sure that there are other uses for it, not that I'm aware of, but yeah, skimming off the top, grabbing a lot of it, that would help a lot. The problem is, what else are you ripping up in the process? So it's, if you want to try to get them off of SAVs, you're probably going to take SAVs with it, and I think that that's why it's not done specifically in regards to SAVs, but I have seen boats, not like in person, but I've seen videos of boats that are doing that. So it's possible.
So as a sailor, and we have Marines here,
Yeah.
and around the 1st of August, we start filling in with vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
We sometimes
Yeah.
And so, this is an opinion question for you. What's your opinion on the fact that the marinas therefore try to cut that grass to help boost boating traffic?
So,
I assume you've seen it.
yeah. My understanding is that those marinas actually have to go through some sort of process in order to be allowed to do that. So there are a lot of, shouldn't say a lot of, but sometimes people just do that if they have a dock of their own and then cut a whole bunch of bay grass. But I know that there's a smaller subset of the SAV Watchers group that is going out and educating those people and saying, like, I don't know if it's legally something they're not allowed to do, but I think it might be because they're protected. I just don't know exactly, so I don't want to say something and be wrong.
Those grasses are important grasses too. They're
Yeah.
not like bad grasses.
Right, yeah. They are good grasses. I'm sure that there's a very, like, I mean, you have to get a boat out there, right? That's just a reality of life and recreation and commercial fishing and whatever. So I think it's more about making that impact as minimal as possible. And I think that marinas and people who own docks have to, the amount that they're able to cut back is limited.
Well,
I
if
think.
you prune your shrubs at home, you cut some off to tame them down, but you're not killing them.
Right.
So they're cuttings,
Yeah.
I think.
Well, if they're
You're
still
not
rooted, then
uprooting-
they
you're not
can,
uprooting.
yeah, then that's different, yeah. That's a lot better than
It seems like
taking the roots
that
out.
would be reasonable
Yeah,
to me, because I'm sick.
right. Yeah, I'm not gonna say never use a boat again, trust me. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks for